Tonight, the kingdom is waiting. You wake to the smell of warm oil and stone. The lantern above your sleeping shelf has been burning through the night on its lowest setting, its flame reduced to the small, steady point that gives just enough light to navigate a sleeping chamber without waking anyone unnecessarily. And the smell of it is the first thing that reaches you before your eyes have opened. The warm and slightly smoky smell of good lamp oil, burning cleanly in a well-maintained wick, which is the smell of every morning you have woken to in the Burrowlands for as long as you can remember. The oil smells different when a wick is poorly trimmed or a reservoir is running low, slightly sharp, slightly acrid, the combustion less complete. And even half asleep, your nose reads the lantern above you as burning correctly, which is satisfying in a small and particular way before the day has technically begun. The sleeping chamber is small and warm, its walls the close-fitted stone of the Burrowlands residential passages, the ceiling low enough that sitting up requires care, the lantern bracket above the shelf positioned specifically so that the flame is out of reach of anyone sitting up too quickly. You know this from experience. The bracket was repositioned twice before its current placement was arrived at. The second repositioning following an incident involving a singed eyebrow that you have no particular desire to repeat. The bracket now sits at exactly the right height, which is to say the height that experience determined it should be at, rather than the height that seemed reasonable before the testing was done. This is generally how things arrive at their correct positions in the Burrowlands. You dress in the tender's working clothes, the canvas jacket with its deep side pockets already loaded from the night before, the wick trimmer in the right pocket, the small adjusting wrench for the bracket mechanisms in the left, the wicking material folded flat in the interior pocket, the striker for emergency relighting in the small pocket at the collar that you added to the jacket yourself, because the design did not originally include one, and the absence was, upon reflection, an obvious oversight. The oil can hangs on its hook beside the door, its reservoir filled last night from the main store, and the folding ladder leans against the wall below it. You check the ladder's hinges with 2 fingers, feeling the tension in the mechanism that holds the sections extended when deployed, and find it correct, and shoulder it along with the oil can, and step out into the main passage. The first passage of the morning route is the main residential corridor of the eastern quarter, a tunnel wide enough for 2 goblins to pass comfortably, and high enough for the wall-mounted lanterns to be out of reach of anyone walking beneath them without assistance, which is the standard height specification that the Burrowlands uses for all residential passages. The lanterns line both walls at regular intervals, their brackets the standard iron fitting that the Warren Smiths have been producing to the same pattern for 3 generations, simple and robust and repairable with tools that any tender carries, which was the design requirement that led to the current pattern after the previous one proved difficult to service in the narrower passages without disassembling more of the fitting than was necessary. The first lantern on the left shows the slight dimming that indicates the oil level is approaching the point where the flame will begin to labor. The light it casts on the passage floor, a degree or 2 warmer in color than the lanterns further along. The combustion beginning to change character, As the reservoir drops toward its lower limit, you set the ladder against the wall below it, deploy the lower section with the quick twist that releases the hinge lock, and climb to the lantern's height with the oil can. The reservoir cap comes off with the small wrench. You top it from the can to the fill mark, scratched inside the reservoir's neck. The cap goes back and is snugged down finger tight, and then a quarter turn with the wrench, and the flame brightens immediately as the improved oil supply reaches the wick, the passage light shifting back to the steady warm bronze that a full reservoir gives. You note the lantern's number in the tender's record that rides in the jacket's inside pocket alongside the wicking material. A folded piece of oilcloth with the route's lanterns listed in their order, and a column beside each one for the day's observations. Not because you will forget. The route is short enough that remembering is easy, but because the record exists for the month-end assessment, when you review which lanterns are cycling through their oil fastest, and whether any brackets are showing the early signs of the mechanical wear that will eventually need attention. The record is the improvement. The lanterns that needed servicing twice a month 2 years ago need it once a month now, and the ones that needed it once a month need it every 6 weeks, because the record identified the patterns, and the patterns identified the causes, and the causes were addressed one by one. Each fix a small improvement that compounded across the whole route into something worth noticing. The third lantern on the right has been showing an inconsistent flame for the past 2 days. The light it produces flickering in a pattern that is not caused by air movement in the passage. You have tested this by standing beside it and watching the other lanterns at the same time, which do not flicker when this one does, but by something in the wick itself, either a fault in the wicking material or a foreign body in the reservoir affecting the oil's draw. You take the lantern from its bracket and carry it down the ladder to examine it properly at passage level, setting it on the flat folding surface you carry for exactly this kind of benchwork in the field, a piece of dense timber hinged to fit flat against the ladder's side and extended when needed. The reservoir comes off with 3 turns of the collar ring, and you tip the remaining oil into the recovery flask before examining the interior with a small mirror that redirects the lantern light into the reservoir's throat, illuminating the bottom where sediment collects when oil has been stored too long or transported in containers that were not sufficiently clean. There is sediment, a thin, dark layer at the reservoir's lowest point. Not much, but enough to explain the wick's inconsistency. The fine particles drawn up into the wicking material with the oil and partially blocking the fibers that should carry the fuel cleanly to the flame. The wick comes out with the trimmer's pulling hook, a short curved tool that grips the wick's upper section without damaging the material, and you examine its lower half in the lantern's own light, reading the discoloration pattern that confirms the sediment diagnosis rather than a fault in the wicking material itself, which is the better finding because the wicking material is more involved to replace than the reservoir is to clean. You flush the reservoir with a small measure of clean oil from the maintenance flask, tip it through twice to carry the sediment out, wipe the interior with the cleaning cloth, and refit the wick with a fresh lower section, spliced to the upper portion that is still good. The splice made with the 3-twist join that holds best in a wicking application because the fibers interlock under tension rather than simply butting together. New oil goes into the fill mark. The collar ring goes back on. The lantern goes back in its bracket. You light it with the striker and watch the flame for a count of 30, observing its behavior in the newly cleaned and refueled condition. It burns without flickering, steady and warm. The bronze light it casts on the passage wall, holding its consistency through the full count. Problem found. Problem resolved. The record gets an entry. The route's middle section passes through the deep passage, the oldest tunnel in this part of the Burrowlands, its walls showing the tool marks of the cutters who made it in a style different from the current method. The cuts deeper and more irregular, the work of hands that had not yet developed the technique that the generations since have refined into something faster and cleaner. The lanterns here are older than those in the residential passage. Their brackets the previous pattern, whose design was superseded, but which remain in service because they still work, and the Burrowlands does not replace what still works. And their reservoirs are the larger size that the old pattern used, which means they need filling less often, but are heavier to carry down the ladder when they need to come off the bracket for maintenance. The deep passage is cooler than the residential section. The stone here older, and the heat from the inhabited chambers not reaching far enough to warm it to the same temperature. And the lantern flames burn with a slightly different quality in the cooler air. Their combustion more complete. The light they produce marginally brighter per unit of oil than the same lanterns would produce in the warmer passages. You have noted this in the route records, and it is one of the reasons that the deep passage lanterns cycle through their oil more slowly than the residential ones. Despite being the same design, the efficiency difference small enough that it would not be obvious to anyone who had not been tracking it systematically for a year, but real enough to show clearly in the numbers once the tracking had been done. The first 3 deep passage lanterns are in good order, their oil levels healthy, and their wicks showing the even burn pattern. That means the previous servicing was done correctly, and the interval since is within the range the current schedule expects. You top 2 of them from the can, the third not yet needing it, and move along the tunnel at the tender's walking pace, the ladder over one shoulder and the oil can in the opposite hand, the weight balanced in the way you settled on after the first month of the route, when the original carrying method was producing an ache in the left shoulder that had no good reason to persist once the solution was obvious. The 4th deep passage lantern has a bracket that has been developing a slight looseness in its wall fitting for the past 3 weeks. The iron sleeve that holds the bracket pin working gradually free of the stone as the cycle of heating and cooling from the lantern's daily operation slowly widens the hole. It has not yet reached the point where the bracket moves perceptibly under the lantern's weight, but it is approaching that point, and the approach is the time to address it rather than the arrival. You take the stone anchor tool from the ladder's side kit and pack the sleeve with the quick-setting compound that the Burrowlands fixers use for exactly this application, pressing it into the gap around the sleeve with the packing tool and smoothing it flush with the wall surface. By the time you return through this passage on the route's return leg, the compound will have set sufficiently to hold and the bracket will be secure for another season at least. And the record will show when it was treated and when it should be checked again. The junction hall sits at the meeting point of 4 passages, its ceiling higher than the standard tunnel height because the space was cut at the intersection of 2 different tunnel cutting periods, and the levels did not align precisely, the result being a chamber whose ceiling rises to the height of the upper passage on its north side and descends to the height of the lower passage on its south, the transition occurring in a diagonal line across the ceiling that the Burrowlands inhabitants refer to as the step, and which means the junction hall has lanterns at 2 different mounting heights depending on which wall they are on. The higher lanterns on the north side require the ladder at its full extension, which you have not needed for any of the morning's previous work, and you deploy it now in the full configuration, setting the feet against the junction hall's uneven floor with the leveling pad that allows the ladder to stand safely on surfaces that are not perfectly flat, a modification you added to the ladder design 3 years ago after an incident that you consider not worth describing in detail, but which made the necessity of a leveling solution immediately and thoroughly apparent. The north side lanterns are in good order, their reservoirs full enough to need only topping, and their wicks burning cleanly in the hall's slightly higher ceilinged air. You work through them in order, the ladder moved along the wall in the 4-step intervals that the lantern spacing requires, the oil can growing lighter with each filling, and the record filling with its neat observations. From the full extension of the ladder, the junction hall looks different than it does from the floor, the diagonal step in the ceiling visible as the architectural anomaly it is, the 2 different cutting methods apparent in the different surface quality of the stone on either side of the line, the older surface on the north slightly rougher, and the newer surface on the south, showing the cleaner finish of the improved technique. You pause at the top of the ladder for a moment between the 3rd and 4th lanterns, not for any particular reason, except that the view from the full extension is the best view in this section of the route, and there is no reason not to take a moment to observe it when the opportunity presents itself. The junction hall below you stretches in its 4 directions, the lanterns casting their overlapping pools of warm bronze light across the stone floor, the passage mouths opening into their respective tunnels in the 4 walls, the whole space holding the quiet of the Burrowlands at mid-morning, the sounds of the inhabited passages at their working level, familiar and warm. The afternoon section of the route passes through the oldest inhabited passages of the eastern quarter, tunnels cut in the Burrowlands' earliest period of expansion, whose walls have acquired the particular character that very old stone acquires when it has been lived beside for many generations. Smooth at the heights where hands have touched it, and slightly worn at the corners where the passage narrows, and bodies have brushed against the stone in passing. A record of habitation as clear as any written record and more durable than most. The lanterns here are a mixed collection, some of the current pattern installed during various upgrade cycles, and some of the older designs that predate the standardization effort, maintained in service because they still function, and because the older brackets are actually better suited to the stone conditions in these passages, the iron having developed a surface oxide layer over the decades that bonds to the stone more securely than fresh iron does. Replacing them would require re-drilling the bracket holes and refitting everything, and the result would be functionally identical at greater cost and effort. The older fittings stay. You work through the afternoon passages with the quieter attention that the afternoon brings. The morning's active servicing mostly complete, and the remaining work a matter of checking and topping and noting, the route's mechanical problems having been found and addressed earlier in the day. 3 lanterns need oil. 1 needs a wick trim, the flame having developed the slight mushrooming at its tip that indicates the wick has grown too long above the flame guide, and the combustion is slightly inefficient as a result, burning the top of the wick faster than its sides and producing a flame that gutters at its peak. The trim takes 30 seconds, and the flame settles immediately into the clean teardrop shape that an optimally trimmed wick produces. The light it casts brightening and steadying as the combustion improves. The passage smells of warm stone and lamp oil, and the faint accumulated smell of the habitation that has been occurring in these tunnels for longer than anyone in the Warren can precisely recall. The smell of people and warmth and the particular combination of materials that constitutes everyday Burrowlands life. It is a good smell. You have walked through it every working day for years, and it has not become invisible the way that some smells become invisible with familiarity. It remains present and comfortable, the smell of a place that is thoroughly and unapologetically itself. The return leg follows the same passages in reverse. The second pass through each lantern, providing a confirmation of the morning's work, and occasionally finding something that the outward direction missed. The deep passage bracket that you packed with compound has set correctly, the surface firm to a thumbnail press, and the bracket showing no movement under a test pull. The repair is complete. The record gets its note. The residential corridor on the return pass shows nothing the morning missed, the lanterns burning in their steady, warm order. The passage holding the early evening quality of light that develops as the inhabited spaces warm through the day, the bronze shifting a degree or two toward amber as the air temperature rises and the combustion responds to it, a variation you have measured and noted as normal, and which is simply the route's way of telling you that the day has advanced and everything is as it should be. Everything within expected parameters. Route complete. The tender's workshop at the route's end is a small room off the main supply corridor, its shelves holding the oil stores and the wicking material and the spare fittings and the reference collection of every bracket pattern in current use in the eastern quarter, each one labelled with its passage location and its installation date and the history of its maintenance. The oil goes on its hook above the refilling trough, and you top it from the main store for tomorrow. The level brought back to its starting mark, so that the morning begins with a full can, and the route is not cut short by running out of oil before the final passages, which is a thing that happened once in your first month on the route, and which has not happened since, because the solution was obvious once the problem had occurred. The ladder hinges are checked and oiled. The mechanism that had shown the slight stiffness in last week's inspection, moving freely after the lubrication you applied then. The improvement confirming that the cause was what you thought it was, and the fix was the right one. The wick trimmer and the adjusting wrench and the striker are cleaned and returned to their jacket pockets. The oilcloth record is unfolded on the workbench, and the day's notes transferred to the month record kept in the workshop. The observations from today's route added to the ongoing picture of the Eastern Quarter's lantern performance. Each entry a small piece of information that on its own means little, and accumulated over months means the difference between a route that is always slightly behind the maintenance cycle and one that is consistently ahead of it. You sit for a while on the bench beside the door when the evening work is done. The warm bronze light of the workshop lantern above you, burning at the level you set it to when you came in, which is the level that is right for sitting at the end of a day's work, not the reading brightness of active work, and not the low point of the sleeping hours, but the middle setting that the lantern's adjustment mechanism allows. The flame turned to the position. You know by the feel of the adjustment wheel under your thumb without needing to look at it, the correct position arrived at through practice, and now simply the position where your thumb stops turning because it knows. The Burrowlands sounds around you in its evening, the passages carrying their familiar combination of voices and movement, and the various mechanical sounds of a warren at the end of its working day. And the workshop is warm and small, and smells of oil and clean metal, and the particular combination of materials that accumulates in a space where the same kind of careful, practical work has been done every day for a long time. The route record for today is complete. The Eastern Quarter's lanterns are burning as they should burn, their oil levels healthy, and their wicks trimmed and their brackets sound, the warm bronze light of the Burrowlands extending through its passages in the steady and uninterrupted way that it extends when everything has been attended to correctly. Tomorrow, there are 2 brackets in the western passage that need their anchor fittings inspected, and 1 lantern in the lower residential section that has been noted for a full reservoir clean rather than just a top-up. The work is always present, always one step ahead of itself, in the particular way that maintenance work is always one step ahead of itself. The list never empty, the improvements never quite finished, the next version of the route already visible in the current one for anyone paying enough attention to see it. Clever, warm, complete,